Hello ladies and gents, hope you're all well, and welcome to night one of our two-night special covering the life of Joseph Carey Merrick, who is better known to the world as the Elephant Man. His grave lies within the City of London cemetery. Now, last time I was here I covered the graves of some of the canonical or acknowledged Jack the Ripper victims. Mary Ann Nichols lies just along here. In here are two possible earlier Jack the Ripper victims, and just there is the memorial stone for Catherine Eddowes. Now, as I take us from the dark world of Jack the Ripper and his victims in 1888, I lead us to just 2 years later, to 1890, as I take you to Joseph's grave. Now, if you want to visit any of these graves, ask it, because this cemetery is so vast it would take the better part of a video to walk you through it to the locations, but ask at the gate to be directed to the traditional crematorium, the tower of which you can see there. You'll walk behind the back of that and you'll take a right onto Gardens Way, where we are now, and you'll walk past the memorial stone to Catherine Eddowes, who is the fourth canonical or acknowledged Jack the Ripper victim, and it's just a short walk from hers to the grave of Joseph Carey Merrick. Now, for many years people thought that he didn't receive any kind of burial because his skeleton is in a case behind a firmly locked door within the Royal London Hospital, and it can only be viewed by medical students for medical research purposes, which is just as well really, because the poor man was turned into a freak show exhibit in his life, and we don't want the same thing happening in his death. So you'll walk past Catherine Eddowes and you'll see this bench here. And you'll walk through. And you'll come to the fourth flower bed, which is bed number 1771. And it wasn't until 2019 that author and historian Joe Vigor-Mangovin, in the process of doing some other research, discovered the original burial entry for Joseph Merrick. Now, on night 2, towards the end of that video, you'll see that original burial entry from the registers, which I've been able to extract from the City of London's burial registers. And at first, Joseph's last resting place was marked with this simple stone in the flower bed. Now, Joe Vigor-Mangovin, her extensive research and with the help of the cemetery, was able to pinpoint the exact burial location for Joseph Merrick, and it wasn't until around 2023 to 2024 that he received one of the Heritage Trail memorial stones, which you'll find throughout the cemetery. It's the City of London Cemetery, Heritage Trail, Joseph Carey Merrick, 1862 to 1890. Now, as I say, he's best known to the world as the Elephant Man. Now, so many people in the world would have heard of the Elephant Man, and a good number of people will have watched the black and white film called The Elephant Man. Now, it's a fantastic film and a very good portrayal of his life, but the only thing they get wrong in that film is that they call him John Merrick, and his name was not John Merrick, it was Joseph Carey Merrick. So you're looking at the last resting place of Joseph Carey Merrick, the Elephant Man, and he was buried in a second-class common grave, as most working class people were buried in common graves where you would share a grave with strangers. He would have been given a decent funeral, which occurred in the chapel of the London Hospital, and then his flesh remains were brought here and buried. Now, Frederick Treves, the surgeon who looked after Joseph in the last days of his life, he took skin samples, and then Joseph Merrick's flesh was parted from the bones in an act which in medieval times was known as Mos Teutonicus, where, and it's horrible to think of, the flesh would be boiled off of the bones and the bones retained, and Joseph's skeleton was mounted as a mounted skeleton, and as I say, he's in a case behind a locked door and can only be viewed by appointment only by certain people, which is just as well. But as I said, it wasn't until 2019 that Joe Mangovin found the burial entry for Joseph and was able to, with the help of the cemetery, locate and pinpoint his exact burial location. So thankfully he did receive in some form or other a Christian burial. Now this part of the cemetery, which in the 1880s, in the time of our ladies of the Jack the Ripper victims and of Joseph himself, was full of common graves, and when it became eventually full up, the whole area was turned into memorial gardens for cremated remains, which nicely enough allowed the cremated remains to go in, which don't go down as deep as a burial, but left the burial remains further down below the surface alone. So we know that our Jack the Ripper ladies and Joseph Carey Merrick lie resting undisturbed, which I'm glad about, because he suffered quite enough in his lifetime, didn't he? Now, this is the grave of Joseph Carey Merrick, and I'll take you into the story of his life, starting right from the birth right up to the very end. So join me for that now. Here we see the very beginning of Joseph's life, his birth certificate. And he was born on the 5th of August 1862 at number 53 Lee Street, Leicester, to Joseph Rockley Merrick and Mary Jane, maiden name of Potterton, and his father's occupation was a warehouseman. And here we see the Lee Street as Joseph would have recognised it. This 1950s photograph shows it before its mass redevelopment, and when Joseph was born he showed no outward signs of deformity for the first few years of his life. Here we see the Lee Street of today as it is now. When Joseph was 11 years old, his mother Mary Jane died, and his father remarried in 1874 to Mrs. Emma Wood Anthill, and thus began the unhappiest period of young Joseph's life, as his father and stepmother showed no signs of affection or love towards him. Joseph ran away several times, but was taken back home by his father. He left school at the age of 13 and secured employment as a cigar roller, but by the age of 16 his deformities, particularly in his hands, had progressed to such a level where he could no longer have the dexterity to perform this task. Joseph spent his days wandering the Leicester streets to avoid the cruel taunts of his stepmother, who would often give him a half plate of food, saying, "And that's more than you have earned." As Joseph became more of a financial burden to his father and stepmother, his dad secured him a hawker's licence, with the view of enabling him to earn money by selling items on the streets and door to door from a haberdashery shop. Sadly though, by this point Joseph's facial deformities were rendering his speech unintelligible, and prospective customers responded to him with such horror because of his appearance, and many wouldn't even open their doors to him. Failing to earn money, upon returning home one day in 1877, he was beaten so badly by his father that he left his unhappy home for good, and thus was rendered homeless, living rough on the streets of Leicester. Upon hearing of his nephew's plight, his uncle Charles Merrick, who was a barber, sought him out and offered him accommodation at his home. For the next 2 years Joseph continued to try and earn a few bob by hawking items, but sadly his appearance drew such negative attention from the public that when his hawker's licence was due for renewal, the commissioners for Hackney carriages withdrew the licence and refused to renew it. Now unemployable and in an era before the welfare state, Joseph had no means to support himself, and sadly his uncle Charles, by this point with a growing family of his own, was unable to financially support Joseph and cope with his rapidly worsening medical condition. This left poor Joseph with no other option than to enter the Leicester Union Workhouse, which you see here in the 1880s, roughly about the time when Joseph joined or entered it, which the 17-year-old Joseph did in late December 1879. After only 12 weeks in the workhouse, Joseph signed himself out on the 22nd of March 1880 and would spend the next few days trying unsuccessfully to secure work. With no other options open to him, poor Joseph had and was left with no choice but to re-enter the workhouse, which he did, this time staying there for the next 4 years. And here we see Joseph Carey Merrick at the Union Workhouse on the 1881 census, marked with the blue arrows. Joseph Merrick, inmate, single, aged 19, occupation a hawker, and born of Leicester. In about 1882, Joseph underwent surgery on his face. The protrusions on his face had now grown to around 22 centimetres, severely inhibiting his ability to speak and eat. The surgery was performed in the workhouse infirmary under the direction of Dr Frederick Treves, during which a large part of the mass was removed. Joseph Merrick concluded that his only escape from the workhouse might be through the world of human novelty exhibitions, best known to us nowadays as freak shows. I know it's an ugly term, but it's what it was, ostensibly. He wrote a speculative letter to Sam Torr, a Leicester music hall comedian and proprietor that he actually knew. Torr came to visit Joseph at the workhouse and decided he could make money exhibiting him, although to retain Joseph's novelty value, he would need to be put on display as a travelling exhibit. To this end, Torr organised a group of managers for his new charge: music hall proprietor J. Ellis, travelling showsman George Hitchcock, and fair owner Sam Roper. On the 3rd of August 1884, Joseph Merrick departed the workhouse to start his new career. The showman named Joseph Merrick the Elephant Man, and thus was born the name of the legend of the Elephant Man, and advertised him as half man and half an elephant. They showed him around the East Midlands, including Leicester and Nottingham, before moving him on to London for the winter season. Hitchcock contacted an acquaintance, a showman named Tom Norman, who ran penny gaff shops in the East End of London, exhibiting human curiosities. Without the need for a meeting, Norman agreed to take over Joseph Merrick's management, and Joseph travelled with Hitchcock to London in November of 1884. When Norman first encountered Joseph Merrick, he was dismayed by the extent of his deformities, fearing that his appearance might be too horrific to be a successful novelty. Indeed, poor Joseph's appearance was so shocking and drew such attention that when in public he was forced to wear this cloth hat and mask to avoid unwanted attention. Nevertheless, Tom Norman exhibited Joseph in the back of an empty shop on the Whitechapel Road. Joseph slept on an iron bed with a curtain drawn around it to afford him some privacy. Observing him sleep one morning, Tom Norman learned that he always slept sitting up, with his legs drawn up and his head resting on his knees. His enlarged head was so heavy, and too heavy to allow him to sleep lying down, and as Joseph Merrick himself put it, he would risk waking with a broken neck. Norman decorated the shop with posters that Hitchcock had provided depicting a monstrous half-man, half-elephant. Norman gathered an audience by standing outside the shop and attracting passers-by with his showman's patter. He would then lead the assembled crowds into the shop, explaining that the Elephant Man was not here to frighten you, but to enlighten you. Pulling the curtain to one side, he allowed onlookers, often visibly horrified, to observe Joseph Merrick up close, while describing the circumstances that had led to his present condition, including his mother's alleged incident of being terrified by a fairground elephant while pregnant with Joseph, which they said caused his condition. And here we see the shop today. It's now a sari centre along the Whitechapel Road. The Elephant Man exhibit was moderately successful and made money primarily from sales of an autobiographical pamphlet. Joseph Merrick was able to put the share of his profits aside in the hope of earning enough money to one day buy a home of his own. The shop on the Whitechapel Road was directly opposite the London Hospital, ideally situated for medical students and doctors to visit, curious to see Joseph Merrick. One such visitor was a young house surgeon named Reginald Tuckett, who, like his colleagues, was intrigued by the Elephant Man's deformities. Tuckett suggested that his senior colleague, Frederick Treves, should pay a visit to Joseph Merrick. Treves first met Joseph Merrick in November at a private viewing that took place before Norman had opened the shop for the day. The viewing lasted for no more than 15 minutes, after which Treves returned to work. Later the same day, he sent Tuckett back to the shop to ask if Joseph Merrick might be willing to go to the hospital for an examination. Norman and Joseph both agreed to the request to allow him to travel the short distance. Without drawing undue attention, Joseph wore his disguise, consisting of an oversized black coat and that famous brown cap and face covering that we saw, made of hessian, to cover his face. He rode in a cab hired by Treves, and it was at this time that these images that we're going to see in a minute were taken. And here we see the London Hospital at the time. After being exhibited for medical students and doctors at the London Hospital, Joseph was returned to Tom Norman and his shop on the Whitechapel Road. Having first been given Frederick Treves' card, and bear that card in mind because it would play quite a large role in Joseph's future. During this period in Victorian Britain, tastes were changing in regards to freak show exhibitions like Norman's, which were becoming a cause for public concern on the grounds of decency and because of the disruption caused by crowds gathering outside them. Shortly after Joseph Merrick's last examination with Treves, the police closed down Norman's shop on the Whitechapel Road, and Joseph's Leicester managers withdrew him from Norman's charge. In 1885, Joseph Merrick went on the road with Sam Roper's travelling fair. Here we see Sam Roper. He befriended two other performers known as Roper's Midgets, Bertram Dooley and Harry Bramley, who occasionally defended Joseph from public harassment. As the dampening of public enthusiasm for freak shows and human oddities continued, the police and magistrates became increasingly vigilant in closing down shows. Joseph Merrick remained a horrifying spectacle to his viewers, but Roper grew nervous about the negative attention he was drawing from public authorities. Joseph's group of managers decided that he should go on a tour in continental Europe, with the hope that the authorities there would be more lenient. His management was assumed by an unknown man, possibly named Ferrari, and they left for the continent. Poor Joseph Merrick was no more successful in the continental Europe than he had been in Britain, and similar actions were taken by authorities to move him out of their jurisdictions. In Brussels, Joseph was deserted by his new manager, who stole his £50 savings, which is about the equivalent of £6,900 in 2025. Abandoned and penniless, Joseph made his way by train to Ostend, where he attempted to board a ferry for Dover, but he was refused passage, most likely because of his appearance. He travelled to Antwerp and was able to board a ship bound for Harwich in Essex. From there, he travelled by train to London and arrived at Liverpool Street Station. Joseph Merrick reached London on the 24th of June 1886, safely back in his own country, but with nowhere to go. He was not eligible to enter a workhouse in London for more than one night. The only place that would accept him permanently or on a long-term basis was the Leicester Union Workhouse, where he had earlier been a permanent resident, but Leicester was 98 miles away. He approached strangers for help, but his speech was unintelligible and his appearance repugnant to passers-by. After drawing a crowd of curious onlookers, Joseph was helped by a policeman into an empty waiting room, where he huddled in a corner, exhausted and unable to make himself understood. His only identifying possession was Frederick Treves' card. Remember, I told you that card would play a role again. The police contacted Treves. He went to the train station, and on recognising Joseph Merrick, he took him in a hansom cab to the London hospital. Joseph was admitted for bronchitis, washed, fed, and then put in a bed in a small isolation room in the hospital's attic. And here is that attic in 2024. And this is where the isolation room once was. I hope you all found that interesting, and join me again tomorrow evening for night 2, our final night, as we cover the rest of the life of Joseph Carey Merrick.